Hello, Daniel.
Hi, Adam. How are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. Semester's in full flow, so essentially everything has to pass through a bottleneck, and that's me. Not everything, of course, but all my duty is basically I'm the bottleneck for them. Everything waits for me to process them. And
That sounds rough, actually, to have so much depend on a pinch point, and where that pinch point is you.
well, the problem is really that it takes a path of least resistance, right? So work is a bit like a liquid. It moves through the pipes and then finds a spot where it basically is being can pass through. And I know that some people actually have this trick of actually dropping stuff or not doing stuff, and so and the work automatically then gets rerouted, right? So they don't get less work to do. But I can't do that.
Huh. So bottlenecks will, in terms of, I suppose, like a historicity about them, paths of least resistance. If there's some sort of topology describing the dynamics of what's happening for any system, you'll tend to get, so where will you get like the maximal flows? Like where will you get like the least resisted ones, at least? Where do you get bottlenecks? Where do
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, of course, depends on what you talk. If you talk about material bottlenecks, I mean, a lot of that is known, right? There's various min cut, max cut algorithms where you say, okay, this is the critical path for the system. If you cut that, then the flow really collapses. Others are not so much. So think of it as with our blood vessels. Think of material flows. Think of, for example, war economies. War economies, you basically try to create a system that's cannot be easily disrupted. Okay, and living organisms are a lot like that. I do think that's also part of the philosophy of Taleb's anti-fragility agenda. So if you disrupt the system again and again and again, the system learns essentially to embrace the disruptions as a way to find out, this is a weak point of my system. Okay, and that means that you basically learn to avoid bottlenecks if possible. However, the system is left alone and very, very robust. So you know that the system is going to be left alone and protected and everything. You can afford to have bottlenecks. Bottlenecks are simply allow you specialization. I mean, look at, for example, the queen in a termite or ant colony. That's a bottleneck. You kill the queen, you kill the colony in a way. I mean, probably not in all species, because then if you kill a queen, another queen will be emerging. But essentially, the queen is a bottleneck. The queen is the part through which the generational turnover of that colony flows. So the queen is heavily protected. So if you have a bottleneck, then you essentially means you can afford the bottleneck because everything passes through that. And you protect it, you optimize it, maybe you improve it. And this is basically when you have bottleneck. If you have a highly disrupted system, a system that has constantly to find ways to respond to disruption, I would claim you will not get bottlenecks, or at least not prominent ones.
with the queen of a eusocial insect colony? I'm thinking of, was it Anthony Zader who's talking about, I think, like genetic inheritance as entailing a kind of like autoencoding, because of like you have to make it to the next generation, you have to pass through this dimensionality reducer. And so in this case, like the queen, if all reproduction for the colony is contingent on her, she would be this bottleneck for inheritance. But then she then makes for I guess both was it a highly controllable system? I think you said the conservation of misery, and that she would create like a
Yes.
vulnerability for the system, and that like you now have to expend resources to protect the queen, because if she's gone, the colony's gone. In that case,
this is related also to the bow tie principle that John Doyle talked about. I think I mentioned it in one of the earlier sessions. I just realized that this is a very similar principle, right? And I completely agree with autoencoder. I don't remember where I saw that for the first time, but I really do agree that probably one of the reasons why the genetic bottleneck actually is so effective is because it's constantly autoencoding again and again and again and again. And it autoencodes only the part that needs to be autoencoded. The rest is, you just grab it from the environment, you do morphogenesis, you do embryogenesis, you do all the concrete adaptations to the concrete environment and forget about everything else. Everything else is just sent through the bottleneck. But of course, the genetic bottleneck is not really so much a bottleneck because it's very distributed. So there's something very interesting about it compared to the other one, in the sense that yes, there's a bottleneck in a way, that you only send very little data to the next environment, but this data is highly holographic. So it's highly distributed through the population and through speciation. So it's distributed in space for individuals, and it's distributed in quality or character because you have different species. So, so there is an interesting way this bottleneck kind of invades the sensitivity of being a single bottleneck, which can be easily attacked. So instead of you don't have to protect the bottleneck anymore because there are bottlenecks, yes, but there are so many of them and across many dimensions.
I wonder, even with a eusocial insect colony, like, so if the queen dies, would there be some sort of like inhibition of like sexual maturation, and maybe there would be like a waiting for that suppressive signal to be released, and then someone else rises who drinks and then suppresses others, and then you have the new one. So you have some of that robustness built in by having a set of potential usurpers or replacements.
You definitely have that, right? I forgot the details now, which species actually exhibit. I know for sure that naked moles have that. So naked moles are actually state-forming mammals, live underground, and they have a queen. And the queen is the only fertile female in the colony. And she essentially keeps the other females infertile by bullying them. They're being basically bullied into stressed out, and they don't get fertile. When the queen dies, then one of the others becomes a queen, right? So we know this actually happens. I'm relatively sure that things like that happen in certain bee colonies, that you might have a juvenile queen and the original queen goes lost, or that she leaves, or there are different mechanisms. But again, I'm not an expert in this field, so I don't know exactly how it is, but I completely agree, right? If a queen dies, the colony, I mean, the colony is not lost, but of course it's costly for the colony, because unless it's in the cycle, it means that you are essentially now thrown back by some time to gain resources.
So what would, if you have a system like so there's the extents to which your bottlenecks could be unified, concentrated, or distributed. And so in this distributed system, you're saying there's like more robustness. But I guess, well, maybe harder to make this whole system pivot because you'd have to get consensus among the different bottlenecks. That might be harder.
Not necessarily. You can get speciation, right? So if you have multiple bottlenecks, for usually multiple, the bottlenecks are linked to different locations. Different locations can be linked to different niches or different environments, different selection pressures. And so essentially you get out of each other's way. When they don't, they are just separated by space, then you have the problem of fraternal conflicts. Because I mean, there's the saying that says no hatred and no wars are worse than fraternal wars. They are the worst wars because they are very similar and they basically occupy the same niche. So basically, the other one is a direct competitor to the niche you have in. I mean, this can work in positive ways if you have cooperation. It can work in adversarial ways. And when that happens, then it's not a good thing. So it works the best if the niches are either far away from each other, either in distance or else in niche relevance or niche character. So you don't interfere with each other.
What is it? Like the competitive exclusion principle. I think that might be the. I think there might be a name for that. I think it might be called the competitive exclusion principle, where it's like,
yeah,
you're not going to have two species similarly adapted for the same niche coexisting. Like you'll have to have some sort of speciation or extinction. Like someone will have to dominate or not, if like,
or fusion. Or fusion. I mean, we have seen that Neanderthals and humans might be. I mean, humans do have some Neanderthal DNA. So if the separation has not happened too long ago, there could be fusion.
So, in terms of, I guess I'm wondering the different kinds of bottlenecks. I'm thinking of both societies of mind and society of minds, but like, so for instance, like, you could have like a governmental structure, more like a monarchy, or you can have something that's more like a loosely federated, like, assemblage of tribes, or you could have, for an individual, like ongoing debates, around like what it means for a person to flourish, where it's like is the self serving like a vital role, like, or as a controller, or is it basically suppressing the flexibility and diversity and openness and diversity you would have from a person who is not integrated in that way according to like the coherent narrative, which can become a kind of. I guess I'm wondering about the trade-offs, the advantages and disadvantages of the kinds of bottlenecks for persons and societies. Like, when do you, so like what kind of like conflict could you have within itself without some sort of like rank and order of values, or something like this?
Well, the bottlenecks are not emerging because somebody likes to have them, right? They are usually the expression of some kind of resource limitation. Okay, so it's not something you seek, but it's something you find. As a society or organisms do not seek bottlenecks. But the point is, organisms, if left unchecked, they will just exploit whatever is available to them. At some point, you end up in a situation where you are constrained. You can't just do what you want. You have a limited capacity. And if you have a limited capacity, then you end up having to arrange whatever you're doing into this limited capacity somehow. This creates structure. Without constraints, or if to take up the topic of today's talk, conversation. If you talk about bottlenecks, that means you have limited capacity. Something is limited in capacity, whatever it is, energy or information or whatever it is, and that forces structure upon the system. Now, is it a good thing? Well, from the perspective of the individual, probably not, right? The individual would rather have the full freedom. From the perspective of the system, it creates complexity. It creates that thing, the conditions to scale up perhaps, or to make it more robust, or to make it more compatible with other systems, or to have some kind of consistency across scales, because otherwise you can't make the bottleneck work. Okay, so the point is, it's like always, right? If you're on your own, you make your own rules. When you live with others and you can move away from each other, you don't have to worry too much about rules. But if you live in confined space, you have to find rules, or your life will be hell. And once you have rules, these rules can take very different character, depending on circumstances, but also depending on history, right? Even same circumstance, you can have two very different histories. Probably one of the best lab for such social experiments is Papua New Guinea, where you have all these valleys there, and sometimes the valleys are so well separated that tribes in a valley will never visit the tribe in another valley, and they may live not far from each other, but they don't interact. And it turns out not only has Papua New Guinea a huge amount of languages, so I think I have a number in mind of 1,200 languages, but also extremely different cultures. And we are talking here about the essentially same or genetically very similar population. And they immigrated to the island early on. I mean, the population might be as old as really 40,000 years old. They immigrated onto the island very early, and nevertheless, they developed in completely different ways. But inside their society, they have these rules, and these rules are actually quite characteristic.
So the rules themselves would act as order parameters. It seems like there's like a kind of I don't know if it's like an entrainment relationship, or maybe they could go separate with complementarity, but like when there are rules for a group of people, it seems like this would require the individual to follow those norms to be governable by those rules.
Mm-hmm.
But then so there's almost like a chicken egg problem, it seems, where it's like the rules create the like a kind of like or a bootstrapping into being. I guess I'm kind of thinking of like there's an example you're using, you mentioned earlier about like I think it's like a longbow manufacturer requiring like basically like there'd be people to create the demand for it, who could use it, but then once they're there, and then you get kind of positive feedback going, but getting it started can be a little bit tricky. It's
Yes, I mean it really depends. Once you get it started, it may be the discovery, it may be the economic niche that you need, right? So if bows are probably not a good example because they are relatively easy to manufacture, even the very primitive ones, and the advantage is immediately visible. So let's take something. What is another example? I mean, a better example is probably, or more an example which shows it more clearly is electricity or electrical devices, magnets, things like that. Magnets are known for a long time. I mean, at least in China, they were known for a long time. Probably even in other countries, and the Chinese use them as compasses. But only when it was discovered that, okay, they have an influence on electricity. Okay, that's what first thing. And then that was not enough. You needed also to see how to make this combination actually workable. And that
I lost you at,
right. So
oh, yeah, we lost you at, you're saying, talking about compasses, and then we needed to work with them.
chicken egg problem. Once you have that, you still have the problem that, for example, yeah, the transition to electricity. So you make the transition to magnets can influence electrical devices. And now the problem is, we have electrical devices, but at this stage, it's still a toy, right? Now, when you learn how magnets can actually induce electricity, you can build dynamos. And now both Edison and Westinghouse understood that to make dynamos viable, you actually have to create a whole infrastructure for this to work, right? So you had to make the decision, okay, we have to distribute the infrastructure. It's not like I'm selling this product and people will just buy it. They will not buy it without the infrastructure. So you will not buy a dynamo if you can't deliver the electricity to everybody who needs it. And this is here the threshold is very high, right? So this is very probably one reason why the Industrial Revolution was so difficult to achieve. The Industrial Revolution was difficult to achieve because to make things viable, a lot of logistical problems had to be solved. Anything pre-industrial was much less depending on large-scale logistics to be available right away. I mean, there were examples for large-scale logistics, which is, of course, the Bronze Age trading. Bronze Age trading went big distances, and you traded bronze or the materials to create bronze from far distances. Essentially, the whole Mediterranean was a trade area. But let's put it this way: this is something that can grow. You can imagine that okay, how to grow that, and then you discover that you don't have enough tin or copper, but others have, and then you scale up from there. But there are things where the infrastructure is really needed. Then you have to really think about how to scale it up. The Romans were also masters of scaling up. They were masters of scaling up stuff.
I think you mentioned it was like during the last conversation about like a scientific mindset and running experiments with counterfactuals, and how this, I think you're saying, like, it wasn't quite there even for the Greeks and the Romans. They just got things done. Like
they just got things done. Yes,
they were just really good at getting things done.
Yeah, they were very practical. They didn't care too much about theory. It's very clear that Roman science was not. If you read Plinius, I mean, it's nowhere close to what the Greeks were able to do, right? So the Romans were practical. They got things done, and whatever was important to be done, they were very, very good at. So they had attention to detail, definitely. I mean, their engineers were amazing. They're water engineers, for example. When you get the water from dozens of kilometers distance, you have to keep the slope at a very low level so you don't create turbulences. And they got fresh water in the cities. I mean, we did not have anything like that for centuries afterwards. Modern water system. I don't know Byzantium. I assume that it will have inherited some of the Roman achievements, but essentially it's a Roman achievement. And after the Roman Empire fell, we essentially wait for the 19th century to have a proper sewer system, the proper water delivery system. Yeah. But the Romans somehow scaled it. What I really found very interesting, Sparta Sparta was militarily very successful place, but they couldn't scale. The way they were set up, they couldn't scale. And the Romans could scale because they didn't care too much about people having to be pure Romans. It would be okay, we accept you as Roman allies or auxiliaries, and they scale. They're always joking that the reason archaeologists like to dig out Roman ruins so much is because they know it's like a big fast food chain. You go to a big fast food chain. I'm not going to name any names for here. Somewhere, and it will always offer the more or less same menu and more or less the same services, and will look almost the same, and the chairs will be the same, and you're familiar. And with Roman cities, it's the same thing. No matter where you go, how far away from Rome you are, you often have a theater, you often have firms, you have a cardo. Cities always look like a franchise. Basically, Rome franchised its city model.
Did they, and they franchised their military? Like,
and the franchised the military. Yes, unfortunately not well enough. That actually messed it up in the end. But yes, in principle, yes.
were they the first to create the idea of I guess I'm thinking so like a Viking shield wall seems analogous to like a Roman phalanx, but this like formation that if you hold it, there's a hole that's greater than some of its parts, but you have to be in a certain mindset to like be able to be disciplined into holding that line.
But this is older. We
That's
know that
older.
the Greeks did that already. I mean, the Greek hoplites, basically, or even the Macedonians later, right? They had these shield walls, and you had to rely. I think the shield was on the left, the spear was on the right, and you had to rely on your right fellow to protect you. So you trusted the guy on the right with your life. Yeah, if anybody ran away, the wall would break. So you really everybody relied on their right.
Does that have its origins in the Greeks, or is that sort of warfare an older idea? Because that
I think the reason the Greeks were this absolutely devastating military machinery was this. That was an innovation. That was a Greek innovation, I think. I don't think that you have the battle chariot, but that is kind of dating back probably to the Hyksos, as far as I can track it. Maybe it's older, but I think the Egyptians got it from the Hyksos. Didn't have it before. The Persians had it in the battle against Alexander the Great, but the battle chariot was more psychological weapon. It wasn't very effective. It was easily defeated. Right, and Alexander defeated it in the same way, by the way, as the Romans would defeat the elephants of Hannibal later. It's exactly the same trick, more or less. Right, but the battle shield wall is actually a Greek invention. It gets revived in different ways later, the tertia by the Spaniards. And also, which is less well known, I don't know how it's called. How do you call it in the westerns when they have the westerns and the cowboys are being attacked and they build with the wagons? They build
circling the wagons.
Circling the wagons. You know who invented that? As far as I know, the Bohemians. Later Czechs. In fact, it was probably invented during the Hussite wars of the Hussites, which is a proto-Protestant religious group, which fought off the rulers, and it was a very, today you would call it a civil war, essentially. And they developed that also as a kind of battle strategy, which was super efficient, super effective. And circling the wagons is very similar to some extent to the shield walls.
But super effective if and only if you don't have too many people defecting on creating that formation. Otherwise, it unravels.
Yeah, but it didn't. I mean, these people fought very well. I mean, I think it was invented by Jan Chichka, who was the military leader, and he was blind as far as I know, and he was never defeated.
I guess I'm wondering about, they're not necessarily incompatible, but they feel that way at the moment. Two different way, or at least two different ways of getting, let's say three, I'm getting that kind of sensibility. So like one would be of like, you actually are playing out the richer rollouts into the future, and you can actually see the consequences of like the construction forming or not. And so it's like, it's almost just like rational self-interest with imagination. Just another one of like losing your, like creating a co-self with the other. It's like one's more like planning, and the other's like more of like an immediate coupling of like, we are one body. And
who says it's it's mutually exclusive?
I don't know, it feels different, but I don't know why.
It is different. It is different. I agree.
It's very different to me.
But they could actually feed on each other, right? So you could imagine that there are these two drivers, and they happen to join for a joint route. This is something that I very much think we totally underestimate, right? We always say, oh, this is the agent and so on. But Michael Lachman has this idea that actually individuals are not just individuals. They're basically focus groups of traits, or focus groups of, call it memes or genes, or entities that are kind of working together for a limited time. When the individual dies, then they dissipate, or they pass, in case of genes, or in case of memes, they pass on to other individuals, but the individuals are basically just vessels of these traits. And so I would not be loath to say, yeah, there are two effects here: mutual self-interest based on future projection, or simply dissolving the self, because simply everybody shares the same meme with you, which is what, for example, religions do. That's, I mean, one of the main arguments of Harari, right? So religions is a kind of synchronizing element, but of course you could also say you have one story, or more or less one narrative, and this narrative is basically holographically encoded in many entities, and that happens to make the entities collaborate. Not because they want to, because they just simply now synchronize as per nature, naturally synchronize as a consequence of that.
But for them to synchronize, I suppose, so there's some synchronization manifold describing the coordination that will happen, where individuals might form a larger super individual for some purpose. So what can serve, so myth potentially can serve this sort of mechanism design function. Is the idea of truth one of those myths that we need, but is also very dangerous? Like, do we need to have some sense of an overarching narrative to create some kind of larger individuality?
Well, you can live with different truths, and people have done so, right? So when people had all these different peoples, and say in the Fertile Crescent, they had all these different gods, and there was this god for that and that god for that, and they were not identical. They were slightly different. There were differences. they would fight. Sometimes they would not even acknowledge their own the mutual existence. They were just there, but they would not actually consider them part of their theogony. Sometimes they would be absorbed. We know that, for example, Hermes and Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes Trismegistus is actually supposedly Greek, but actually it's an Egyptian god deity, and it was basically absorbed into the Greek pantheon. The Romans famously identified their gods with the corresponding Greek gods, and the identification is not always. Sometimes it fits. Jupiter and Zeus, yes, they can be fit. Maybe they are even the same deity in the Indo-European context. But there are other deities which don't fit, and they don't. You kind of tack them together, but it's not really well founded. And there is, for example, one deity in Roman society that the Greeks don't even have, and yet that deity is more important to some extent than Jupiter himself, and that's Terminus. Terminus is the god of the borders. So if you have land borders, or you have a piece of land and you put the borders, that is a deity. The Romans have that. They already have claims of stakes. This is so very unique.
Where did they get Terminus? Did they invent him or borrow?
Yeah. Well, I don't know where it comes from, but it is a Roman deity. I don't think the Greeks have anything analog, nothing like that. It's very clear that the Romans had a concept of land possession, much stronger than the Greeks had. Yeah, and
It made a notion of divinity to correspond to it. That is fascinating.
Yeah, and the divinity is quite high up in the ranking. I think he's ranking with Jupiter either together or above him, or I think he's very highly ranked. There are no mythologies about them, about Terminus too, which is kind of weird because it means that you don't joke about land possession, right? It's like you don't joke about security when you pass security in the airport. You don't make jokes there. This is not something to joke about. So truths or deities can be very, basically overlapping and not really meshing up. But the idea that there is some kind of coherent story emerges, of course, in monotheism. Of course, it also emerges in the view of the Greeks of the cosmos, of the universal order of the world. And in fact, what does it change? It changes a couple of things. In the moment you say there is this kind of joint, I'll avoid the word truth for a second, joint reality. It's a joint thing that basically decide this is what we all have in common. Several things happen. Number one, it means we all play on the same playground. Yeah, that we're not like having basic playgrounds that interact and don't actually intersect. There are actually some horror stories which live on the premise that you have actually multiple worlds that they kind of intersect, and only sometimes they meet, and then you see spirits and ghosts on the other side. There's a fantastic horror story by Algernon Blackwood, the Willows. If you don't know it, it's a really chilling story, absolutely chilling story. Very well written.
Algernon Blackwood?
I think that's the name, yes.
That has to be a self-given name, I hope. Otherwise, this person was fated to do what they're doing.
Yeah, no, I think it's considered a classic. The Willows is considered one of the classic horror stories, right, on the level of Dracula and things like that, or the monkey's paw or something. It's really classic, and it's chilling. It's really, I don't recommend reading it in a camping tour. Really not. Don't read it on a camping tour. Best to read it when it's lots of people around you and it's bright light, daylight in a cafe or something. That's probably okay, but otherwise, really. Anyway, so the realities, multiple realities, suddenly are not multiple realities anymore. They live in the same reality. which forces several things. It forces order. It forces, okay, there must be common order to everybody. We all have to agree on certain principles that are valid for anyone. And not just, you can't just choose, mix and match. You can't just ignore each other. In other words, in the language that we used before, you have constrained in the mental space of what's acceptable. There's a mental space in which you move, and you're basically sharing this space, right? So instead of having an airplane all by yourself where you can just, lean back and just spread yourself on the seats and just ignore what's going on around you, you're now sitting very tight with the neighbors in the same spot, the same airplane, and you have to, okay, we'll share the armrest, and I will not lean back too much, and you basically start having to negotiate your way around. On the other hand, well, we do believe when we do science that the reality is like that. It's a shared reality, right? So you can't just argue reality away. And it's a very interesting story. Can you argue reality away? And to some extent you can. You can get through life very well being a flat earther. Perfectly fine, right? And as long as you do not have to do navigation on large distances, you can be a flat earther and live your life without any problems. So not that I'm defending that as a scientific statement, but I'm saying you can decide I'm a flat earther and that is fine. And that's perfectly well. You can say, for example, you can, if you live in the US, you know exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about imperial system. Right? You can live without a metric system. It's perfectly okay to do that. In fact,
well,
one of the key...
it was okay until a couple catastrophes with NASA where they were having trouble keeping track of units. Wasn't always, there were some externalities.
That because they had to talk, and I think the people who used the imperial system were not the Americans. It was the British.
Oh.
I think it was the British that did that. So in the moment you have to talk to others, you have to have a joint reality. You have to have a joint reality in which you operate. Otherwise, it doesn't work. But you have a point. Okay, so how long is it convenient to work with imperial system? So if you're a medieval person and all you do, you measure distances with inches, feet, yards, miles. These are related by integer scalings. So I think it's 12 inches is one foot, 3 feet is 1 yard, etc. So these are integer numbers. They're not all consistent, but there's always an integer factor between them. Same if you take a liquid ounce as a weight, or a liquid ounce as a volume, or an ounce as a weight. They are related by water as a weight of water. So it's a volume. Area is measured again differently. But the point is, and this is very important, as long as you do not mix areas, volumes, lengths, and these things with each other, you do not have the need to unify anything. You can talk about inches, you can talk about ounces, you can talk about stones. Okay, ounces and stones are related because their weight and volume can be translated into each other very easily. But otherwise, you don't care about it. Only in the moment when you now are forced, you do mathematics, you start doing integration, measuring the volume of objects using lengths. That's basically Kepler has a very nice little piece of work where he essentially derives an integration rule for the volume of barrels. Says, okay, there's a barrel and you want to know how much volume is in the barrel by 3 measurements. And he then derives the volume of this barrel just by these 3 length measurements. So he now does an integration. The moment you start doing that, you are forced to convert lengths into volume measures. And now the metric system makes sense.
Although even then, like what it seems like what you're describing is better than the truth, and that it's like basically a capacity for ensuring coherence where it's needed and harmonization among like modes of sense making and adaptation. But like something like I guess maybe better than the truth, something like a semi-sacralized epistemic commons, something like science, like the way we make like our notions about like a but
It's still better.
was that
Simply, it's a joint illusion. It's a joint illusion. It's a joint illusion. So basically, the illusion has the property that if I have the illusion, likely you have the same illusion, we can agree on the illusion, and then we don't fight about it. I'm now talking about, let's talk physical truth, which is probably easiest to have. Physical truth, first of all, I don't like the word at all, right? So, not that I don't like it. I think that it's a dangerous word, because whenever somebody talks about truth, I get edgy. I see red flags all over the place. If somebody says they know the truth, that's edgy, because even as scientists, we don't know the truth. What we do is we try to approach an abstract truth. What does it mean? We approach abstract truth. We try to agree on what will happen in the physical world if we do certain things, and we try to make that find the reaction of the real of the physical world to what we do. We try to find things that make us all agree on what's going on there. So it's a mixture of getting the physical world to do certain things and us having a model that is transferable and that everybody agrees upon as well as possible. So that if I do, for example, let's take a simple example. If I drop a stone, the stone drops, and then there's a acceleration, g half t squared is how much it falls per after a given time, and you would do the same experiment, you get the same result to the precision that you have. Then we kind of agree this is kind of a joint model of what happens. But of course, then there are refinements, then there are this and that, and the various things that are very specific to your place. Perhaps the gravity is slightly different. Perhaps you are out in space when things again work differently, and then you have to find a theory that explains that. So essentially, the truth doesn't actually exist out there. There's something happening. There's some physical machinery that does stuff. We have a theory that kind of through which we look at what happens out there. And if that theory is consistent across individuals that do the same experiment, then we say, okay, this is scientifically valid theory. And now we could say, well, this is the scientific truth, but it's not the truth, because it could be there are some effects that we have not described with this theory, and we haven't seen them, or the theory is inconsistent, and we have failed to see that it's inconsistent, or the theory is okay on certain timescales, but not on others, etc., etc. So the concept of this is a scientific truth is a very dangerous concept, right? As a simple approximation, it's okay to say, oh, this is the truth, scientific truth, but it's a dangerous word to use, because people pretend this is the absolutely undisputed thing that's going on, and that's usually not the case. It gets worse when you start going to things, softer topics like in biology. It has improved, but for example, in medicine, it's already getting difficult. What's the truth? What's the illness of this person? What do they react to? Different people react to different things in the same illness, right? You go to history, it gets even worse, right? So was Nero as emperor an evil emperor, or was he just maligned by his contemporaries? And the problem is now everything we know about him was filtered through his contemporaries. So how do we approach something that, if we were to live in Roman times and would see what Nero is doing, would be consistent with what we think about him?
You have me wondering about, so it seems like this truth with a capital T, could you call it like a kind of Neoplatonism? And like, it's like a little bit more of a Greek notion, but like the Romans, they would have more of this like pragmatic truth of like, they were getting things done. And so they would have basically, the truth is like the Schelling point of reality, which is like, they're coordinating around what actually gets things done. Like I say, it's like this, you say it's similar, but, and can we come to like functional agreement? But this like truth to which one would bend a knee and shut down judgment, or not shut down judgment, but like a singular type of truth that seems, I don't know, is that the Greeks?
Yeah, the problem is maybe it exists, right? Maybe there's some simple truth that actually exists. The problem is we will never know. We cannot ever know, right? And the problem is that this is often used as for example, political argumentation, because it creates like this direct hotline to the deity. Direct hotline, the deity has told me this is the truth. When that happens,
and I just so happen to have the hotline. Like
yes, and yes, and people
so
will claim to have the
who has the phone. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let's put it this way: some people may have had the hotline. I mean, Newton and Gauss and Einstein, they probably had a hotline, right? Or for Neumann, it's very hard to believe they didn't. But this is very, very rare.
It's it. I always like, I'm both very compelled by it, and it sits a little uneasy with me. Like, but Nietzsche's ad hominem against Socrates, where he says like it was like a beauty valuing culture, and out of a kind of like resentment and a kind of power grab, he created this world of philosopher kings and ideal forms where he could like, where his will to power could be satisfied. But like, I don't know how far I want to go with that. It makes me nervous. But this idea though of like something tyranny prone, and a kind of even like a domination impulse being like caught up within it, of what would seem to be just like, oh, truth, what could be more truth, goodness, beauty. Careful.
Yeah. I mean, let's put it this way: I accept it as a working hypothesis. I accept it as a tool to guide thinking. I accept truth as a tool to direct where do we want to go. As a scientist, scientists often say we're looking for the truth, and I don't think they mean it in a negative way. What they mean is they try to find this ground on which everybody can agree, that things can be jointly interpreted, and can be jointly predicted. I would say this is what I would think is what we understand as scientific truth. Very pragmatic, right? It's we can jointly interpret something and we can jointly predict. So far, I can live with this. What is dangerous is that if that turns out to be ill-defined, and we have seen that very well actually in the COVID crisis. The COVID crisis, one of the big problems that science was facing is scientists are usually quite well aware of the uncertainty of measurement. In topics like physics, the uncertainty has been essentially almost squeezed out of the system. I mean, it's always there, right? But it's so far away from anything that's tangible that people can say, oh, gravitational constant at this location is G equals blah, 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 blah. So many digits, you can all state them. That's almost as good as truth, as long as you don't do cosmology or something, right? As you move towards biology, as you move towards medicine, things become very murky. The statistics is really bad, right? And one reason it's bad is not just because statistics is hard to do, but because that's my personal opinion now. Biology doesn't want to be statistical. In the sense, as an organism, you want to be unpredictable. You don't want to be easily clusterable, because if you're easily clusterable, some viruses can find your weak points. In fact, if organisms didn't have to procreate and find a partner to mate, they probably would, each of them trying to go in their separate niche and really be different from others, incomparable. Of course, that's not possible because they have to, coordinate, they have to mate, they have to communicate. There are all these pressures that try to keep them together. But if they could choose, they would be very different. Right? Choose, evolutionarily choose.
That's a really interesting tension. So there's this like tension for regularity and legibility for coordinating in certain ways. But if you optimize for that too much, you are now a sitting duck for an antagonistic optimizer exploiting you. The conservation of misery strikes again.
Exactly. Yeah, you're basically opening the door to a vector. It's a bit like having all your money in one bank, right? It's again John Doyle's bow tie idea in a way, in an abstract way. So what does it mean for us? It means that if that's true, and even if it's not true, but we know that the statistics in biology is not good. And so there's a lot of uncertainty with every statement that people made about COVID is going to do this, and it's going to kill that many people, and on this age, and this has that effect. It's incredibly difficult to disentangle. Scientists accept that, and they realize that. And they have different opinions what should be done, because the problem with doing is that doing is a bottleneck again, right? So there's stuff going on, but when you have to make a decision, the decisions are not arbitrary. You can't just create some kind of big, complicated super action decision. The actions that you take on a political level or an individual level are always low bandwidth processes. So you better invest the bandwidth well. So for example, if I say I'm going to do a lockdown now, or I'm going to do the lockdown in 3 months, that's a big decision. You can't just undo it. This is a decision you make now or later, or you can postpone it. But this decision every decision is low bandwidth, but very high impact. And the general public has a problem understanding that, because they are used to clear facts and clear decisions usually. So when I'm driving a car, I go left, I go right. It's not always right. There are crisis situations where you don't know how to react, but most of the time decisions are simple and clear. And you do this way or do this way. There's a reason why many companies have all these guidelines and UPRs and rules and regulations, so that you don't have to make decisions. The decisions are essentially made for you, because this is a condensed, crystallized experience or institutional knowledge. In COVID, basically, we were caught outside of the playbook. There was no playbook for COVID. Nobody knew what to do. It's not entirely true, actually. There were several countries, including the UK, that actually had a contingency plan, but it was not enacted. So the contingency plan was not actually carried out. But this is only secondary. The important part is that the general public was very confused. And then people said, oh, let's do this, let's do that, let's do this, let's do that. Or the scientists say that. No, the scientists say this. So the problem is, what's the truth now? What is the truth? Now, the truth, or an approximation of the truth, would be you create 1 million clones of planet Earth and start them at the same point in time, say December 2019, and let them run. And you try out all these things and get the statistics. And then you know what is the best action to take. This is basically what you would do in reinforcement learning. The problem is you can't do that. You don't have that model, you don't have the opportunity, you can't just restart the simulation, and you don't know which factors end up actually affecting the outcomes. If you look at Italy had a huge number of COVID deaths at the beginning in Bergamo, which is a rich area. So that you can't say that these people don't have a health system. They have a good health system, but I don't really know exactly why they died. And then, for example, the UK initially did not have at all any COVID, so they thought they were fine. And then a month later, it exploded. So the question is, what are the right things to look at? And different people made different guesses. And people got very angry that politicians looked so helpless. But the reality was, maybe politicians should just have, I mean, sometimes politicians said, we'll do that, and made a decision. Like in New Zealand, they decided, okay, hard lockdown. That's what they did. Hard lockdown, they kept COVID out until Omicron, right? And when Omicron came, they had to give up. It was not possible anymore. But basically until Omicron, they had COVID under control. Similar what happened to Spanish flu in Samoa. You had Western Samoa and you had American Samoa. Western Samoa, I think, had a death rate something between 20 or 30%. In American Samoa, they locked down everything strictly, and they had no deaths of the Spanish flu. And these are neighbors, okay? So the concept of truth here is much more wobbly, because nobody can say what was the right thing to do.
We didn't have the compute to do the rollouts, and we didn't have the credit assignment problem was too intractable, even if we could. And
we didn't have the data. We did not know what are the parameters. Is this the contagion by people meeting up? Is it a school? Was it touching stuff? Was it air? I mean, we know now that it's mostly airborne, right? So the whole disinfection stuff was probably overkill, but who knew? Nobody knew that at the time. So people say, oh, we should have not. No, we did not know that.
But it's like we need something maybe like a lesser Roman god. Like Terminus might be too much for truth, but like, I don't know, like what's like a
Veritas? In vino veritas. Yeah, I think the problem here is really we need to be a little bit more modest in our expectations. We need to accept sometimes you do not know. Sometimes there is an uncertainty, and that is part of the game. It is not resolvable. And then you have to ask, okay, what's the best I can do with my knowledge? And that opinion can differ, especially if there are different levels of risk averseness. So some people are very risk averse and other people are not. And the question is, who's right? Maybe none of them. I mean, if you climb mountains, you like climbing mountains, you know, and free climbing, it's dangerous, but you accept the danger. You tell me to do that, I say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not, this is not my level of risk, but that's fine. The problem with COVID is you cannot be risk friendly on your own. When you are risk friendly, you involve others. And now the question is, where's the balance? What's the balance to strike?
Different than the flat earthers, there's definitely negative externalities there for beliefs. Like the flat earthers, it could be just fine. Like maybe
exactly doesn't hurt anybody. I mean, they don't have to travel to Australia. Nobody forces them to travel to Australia.
But here there's phalanxes we need to maintain. We need to hold the line, and we need the epistemics to be conducive to that. Otherwise, it doesn't work. You don't achieve.
The problem with the COVID is actually really interesting, because I think that when you talk about, I had conversations with various people, and there were the people that, for example, didn't believe in vaccination, didn't believe in masks, and so on and so on. Now the point is, you know, as long as it just affects them, it's fine, right? Why not? The problem is, I remember very distinctly when with the whole COVID thing started, that people working for Trump's Transport of London, the people who work for the public services, the buses and so on, there were, I think, dozens of them died in a very short period, dozens of them, and passengers, for example, cuffed at drivers. I mean, seriously, this is clearly It's very clearly not neutral, right? It has an effect. People are affected. It's not like you can say, okay, it doesn't matter. People were affected by this. There were other things like nurses, and I talked to people in the health department. Basically, they just say, I mean, people just ignore things or claim it's not happening, and it is happening. I mean, these people work with that. Now, there are of course nurses say, I don't want to be vaccinated. I can see the fear of vaccination. Some people are sensitive to that. Some people may not feel that their body doesn't react well to vaccinations in general. I can see that one. The mask thing is a different story. Sometimes it felt really like I don't wear the mask because this is a political statement, not because just it's uncomfortable. It's a political statement. It's almost like smoking. Here's a sign, no smoking. They smoke, right? At some point, smoking just became obsolete. People just, it was enough. You didn't do that. You wouldn't. It doesn't make you cool. It's like seatbelts in cars. Seatbelts in cars, at some point there was a really big discussion. Shall we do that? Shall we? Do seatbelts kill people sometimes? Yes, they do. Still, they save many more people than they kill. And that is kind of the type of thinking that at some point, basically people just tire of the argument. That's what happens. So it's not like they converge to the truth. They just tire of the argument. Now, if today I will just invent a case in a very important paper, there is a study that proves no, seatbelts actually kill people more than they help them. Then people say, oh, 50 years we did the wrong thing. Right? But this is how knowledge works. I don't think this is the case, by the way. I have to, disclaimer. Yeah, I do believe seatbelts really help. But I'm just saying that if we find there's a reversal of our understanding, it's not a reversal of truth. It's not that we were lied to either. It was just a collective of the best knowledge we had at the time that made us take action. And sometimes you can refine. Sometimes you find, okay, perhaps the vaccination helped. Maybe we shouldn't give them to people who have these illnesses. Maybe the masks did help, didn't help. We don't know. And some people say, well, the mental illnesses has increased during lockdown, so the lockdown was a bad idea. Maybe the lockdown should have been earlier, and then it could have been spared altogether. For example, if you had done the lockdown at the beginning of Corona, squished Corona right away, nipped it in the bud, maybe we wouldn't have the pandemic in the first place. Or we would have had vaccination so early that it would never have gone to that level that it went.
So we need like a concept of like truth, a veritas that's strong enough that we can coordinate around it, but not one that becomes basically inflexible and tyrannical and resistant to updating.
Exactly.
And so it's not quite, yeah. It's Carl Sagan's book, was it A Demon Haunted World, Science is a Candle in the Dark. That gave me I think that replaced religion for me when I was young, and it gave me like there was like enough of a sense of like even like a holiness about the endeavor, but like there was a beauty to it, but it was imperfect. It was like you're always wrong. You're never, you're always gonna, never assume you're not being fooled in some ways. But it's still precious. Like you're still seeking to do the best you can.
Yes.
Best understand, but it will always elude you. It's just a candle. It's.
And the always wrong is probably.
Candle,
I also think it's probably. I know that Popper meant well, but I'm actually thinking his way of saying things is actually too negative, and also saying always wrong is also too negative, because it implies, oh, the scientists don't know anything. That's not entirely true. People live much longer today. You can do operations on people and save them, which would have died only 100 years ago, you can heal things that are unbelievable. You can extend people's lives by a lot on really unbelievable circumstance. We can fly to the moon. So I don't think we are wrong. Wrong is not the term I would choose. I would say something else. We should accept.
That's an impressive candle that can take you to the moon.
Yes, that's a big one. Yes, so 110 meters long.
Yeah.
And the candle burns from the bottom. Very important. It is the decision that we're trying to take should be reflecting our very best approximation to this jointly consistent grounds that hold up as well as possible to the future. Doesn't guarantee it's the case, but this is what we want. When people say do something because of an agenda, it means that they're not caring about this. They're caring about creating something favorable for them. They take basically, they are partial, they are partisan, and they decide, okay, we have picked this direction for our purpose. This is what the, say, people on the street are afraid of being taken advantage of. I don't blame them for that, right? People are very afraid of being taken advantage of, right? Sometimes they are right even. It's probably true, enough true. It's probably a good way of describing the situation in enough cases that they're probably right. Still, I think we need to keep not just the candle, we need to keep the flag of truth seeking, rather truth seeking up, saying we are trying to find what's going on. We're trying to be consistent. We're trying to do decisions that are reflecting our best understanding of what's a good future. But of course, different agents have probably different thinking of what's good for the future. But that's a different story. That, in my opinion, is not part of the story of truth anymore. That is part of the story of politics. And it gets nasty when politics distorts truth in the service of partisan agendas.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to next time.